There's a man at the end of the street. He's been watching us for years. Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well. This first started happening 15 years ago and would take place over the next 13 years of my life. It all started in the summertime, about 4 months after we had moved to a new house in a different state. I was 9 years old at the time and I didn't really have any friends in the area. One day I was out in the front yard helping my dad with yard work. He would mow the front and backyards, and I would either pick dandelions out of the ground or water the plants at the front of the house. Not super helpful, I know, but I was 9 and wasn't allowed to do anything with the lawn mower besides maybe pull the cord to start the motor. My dad had just finished the front yard and had moved his way to the backyard, while I stayed in the front yard to finish up. I remember seeing a package on the porch in front of our door and going up to pick it up, and that was when I turned around and saw him. A man in his late 30s, with long dark hair tied in a ponytail hanging down past his shoulders, wearing a plain white t-shirt, black pajama pants and no socks or shoes. He was standing at the end of our street, standing with his arms crossed and staring directly at me. Now for context, my house is 4 houses down from the end of the street. At the end of my street there is a road that forms a T-shaped intersection. On the other side of this intersection from my house there are 3 houses, with one house lined up with the middle of my street and the other 2 houses sitting to the right of it. To the left of the house lined up with my street is an old steel treating factory that existed surrounded by houses in our neighborhood and was still active 24/7. This man was standing in front of the house lined up with my street, at the top of the T-shaped intersection. He was standing right off the edge of the street and in front of what I assumed was his house, just staring at me. As soon as I saw him I immediately froze and stared back at him, with a sudden uneasy feeling washing over me. The longer I looked at him, the more red flags I began to notice. To my 9-year-old mind, this man was dressed very strangely and that had already been an immediate red flag, but the creepiest thing that stood out to me was his face. His face had absolutely no expression of any kind, there was just this intense and piercing stare with him looking directly at me. It felt like he was staring right through me and for at least 2 minutes we stared at each other, never looking away or even blinking. Eventually the uneasy feeling built up enough for me to slowly walk myself down off the porch and over to the side of our house, never looking away from the man. When I made it out of sight, I ran to the backyard to tell my dad about what had just happened. I came up to him as he finished mowing the backyard and described what I had seen, and that was when he told me that he had seen this man the other day doing the same thing, except just staring straight down our street. Arms crossed, plain white t-shirt, pajama pants, no shoes, just like when I had seen him. After that my dad told me that he thought that man seemed off, and to stay far far away from him. Unfortunately, that would not be the last time that I saw the man at the end of our street. From that point on I would see this man much more often. I would be riding in the car with my family or outside doing something in our yard or on our block, and I would look over and see him standing in the same spot, arms crossed, intensely staring. He wasn't there 24/7, but at least 3 days a week I would see him outside, sometimes for 5 or more hours at a time. If not staring at me, staring at someone walking their dog or a car passing by. Once I tried to figure out his schedule so I wouldn't have to be around him as much, but it felt too creepy keeping track of him because he would occasionally start scanning his head around looking for people to lock onto, which really creeped me out. Now some of you may be thinking, he's just staring and not doing anything, that's not that bad, right? Well sadly, I would later find out that things were far worse than I had ever imagined. So fast forward about 9 years. I am now 18 years old and looking to get a job to save up for my first car. I hadn't really been able to save any money up to that point and my parents weren't in any position to be able to help me with purchasing one, so I knew that I had to try and find a job that would be easy for me to get to and that would pay me enough for me to hopefully get a cheap car quickly. Lo and behold, the steel treating factory next to the creepy man's house has a now hiring sign out front and I decided that a 2-minute walk to work had to be worth it, even if it meant walking by creepy man's house. I had seen this guy doing this routine for almost a decade at this point and figured that it wasn't going to be a problem. So I apply, and end up getting the job. It was hard work which usually consisted of heavy physical labor and keeping up a constant pace, but nothing I hadn't expected. I started off fairly slowly but ended up getting much better and able to do tasks much faster. About 3 months in, I was assigned to work on a machine that I had not previously worked on, located in the loading dock. From the loading dock, I had a clear view of the wooden fence that separated the factory loading zone from the creepy man's house, as well as the front of his driveway where he would normally stand. I couldn't see the man standing at his post, but I was able to notice a large hole in the fence, which seemed like it had been made in some kind of accident. The fence was not broken cleanly, but there were splinters and cracks in the fence where the hole had been made. I asked the floor worker who was with me at the dock if he knew anything about this, and this actually got us into a longer conversation about the creepy man. Ronnie had been with the steel treating factory for over 15 years, and had seen the man during his staring routine more than once. According to Ronnie, the hole in the fence had been made by Creepy Man, and he had told the managers of the plant that it had been an accident with his truck. But that's not all. Ronnie then went on to tell me that creepy neighbor guy actually runs a daycare out of his house, and that it was an unregistered business and has actually led to police being called on him more than once. This surprised me, as I had never seen the police over at his house before, but after Ronnie told me this, something else occurred to me. When looking at Creepy Man's house, whenever his van wasn't sitting in the driveway, you could see one of those children's mini playgrounds with a slide and toys built into it, the kind toddlers would play with. This always struck me as odd because never once in those 9 years up to that point had I ever seen anybody else come or go from his house, especially not any children. But I had never really dedicated much thought into it. After Ronnie told me this, I thought back to when I had first seen him as a 9-year-old and all the other times he had stared at me growing up, and I began to wonder if he had been secretly plotting to try and get me over to his unofficial daycare. Sadly, I couldn't really confirm what Ronnie had told me, and at this point I had been dealing with my own personal problems at home, and so I just filed the story into the back of my head as something I would not at all be surprised to find out was true. I left that job not long after this. I had saved up the money I needed for a car and was able to make my way into the career field I had been hoping to make it into. Fast forward to 3 years later, and to one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me and the reason for my posting this. At this point I had moved away from home, but ended up having to move back home with my parents for reasons I'm not going to get into. I had also met my girlfriend and we would spend some nights driving over to my parents' house to watch old movies or play games with my janky basement setup. By this point my girlfriend was aware of the creepy man but paid him as much mind as anybody else. As creepy as he wasn't breaking the law by standing there, and our lives already had too much going on for us to be focusing our time and attention on his weirdness. On this night, I was driving home with my girlfriend for a normal night of watching movies. I didn't want to block my mother's car in on our single-lane driveway, so I had recently started parking in the grass patch behind our house. Behind our house was an alley that ran past everybody's backyards. Our backyard had a wooden fence up against the alley, with a separate garage building which opened up into the alley. I had started to park in the grass patch area in between the garage doors and the alley more often, and so that was the direction I had been driving home, silently hoping to myself that the creepy man wouldn't be outside on a pleasant night like this. Well, of course, I had jinxed it, and the way home that I was going ended up taking us right past him, standing and staring us down. I locked eyes with him very briefly as we drove past him, headed to the right side of the T intersection to turn into the alley to go behind my house. But here's where things got scary. For some reason, I don't know why, as we passed by the creepy man I got a really bad feeling. A feeling very similar to the day I had first seen him, a gut-wrenching something is wrong kind of feeling. And so I decided to look in my driver's side mirror. To my horror, the creepy man had actually left his post, and started walking quickly in my direction. I can honestly say that this was the first time I had ever seen the creepy man not standing completely still, and here he was walking the same direction I had gone. As my thoughts started racing, I turned into the alleyway and then went 4 houses down, turning into the grass patch behind the garage in our backyard. I immediately told my girlfriend what I had seen and how strange it was. I did not want to freak her out, but I didn't want her to get blindsided if something bad was about to happen. From the angle that my car was parked, I could turn around in my driver's seat and stare at the alleyway through the slits in the wooden fence in our backyard. I would be able to see if he was coming and see if he rounded the corner. I locked my car doors, turned in my seat and reached into my pocket to tightly grip my pocket knife. My eyes widened and my heart started beating fast as I saw him casually walking down the alley through the slits, right up to the edge of the wooden fence, and then pause. After a few moments, he turned around 180 degrees and started walking back down the alley in the direction he had come from. I waited about 2 minutes before getting out of my car and slowly approaching the edge of the fence, then walking into the alley to see that he was gone. I have thought about this quite a bit since it happened 2 years ago. I don't actually know if he recognized me or the house that I had pulled into, or why he chose that night to follow me and my girlfriend and scare the hell out of us. Honestly, I don't really care. I was able to move out of that house shortly after that happened and am now living with my girlfriend, who today is my fiancé copywritee. But to the man that stared at me and my entire neighborhood for over half my life, and who followed me and my girlfriend into a dark alley for God knows what reason, let's never meet again.